At 3:47 a.m., something impossible was scratching at my door. I'd been living alone in these Blue Ridge Mountains for 3 years now, and nothing, not bears, not drunk hunters, not even my own nightmares, had ever made a sound quite like that. Desperate, purposeful, human-like. When I cracked open the heavy oak door, my blood ran cold. A mother raccoon sat on my weathered porch, and I'll be damned if she wasn't crying. Real tears streaming down that masked face, catching the moonlight like broken glass. In her mouth hung a tiny cub, limp as a rag doll, its little chest barely moving. She looked up at me with those dark, wet eyes, looked right through me, like she knew something I didn't, like she'd been searching for me specifically. "Well, I'll be," I whispered, my voice cracking in the mountain silence. She set her baby down gently and stepped back, waiting. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months ago, I was a different man. Dr. Thomas Walker, they called me then, the veterinarian who could work miracles with his hands, who'd stay up all night nursing an injured barn owl back to health. Emma used to joke that I loved animals more than people, and maybe she was right, but that was before the accident. Before everything went to hell in a handbasket. The cabin I'd bought, sight unseen, sat like a wooden fortress against the world, 30 miles from the nearest neighbor, 40 from town. No cell towers, no internet, just me and the ghosts that followed me here. Emma's voice still echoed in these empty rooms. "Every creature deserves a chance, Tommy. Every single one." Easy words when you're alive to say them. I'd given up my practice after the funeral. Couldn't bear to heal animals when I couldn't save the two people who mattered most. The irony wasn't lost on me. A man who'd dedicated his life to preserving life, now running from it like a coward. But some wounds cut too deep for healing, and mine had festered for 3 long years. The locals in Millbrook knew better than to bother the hermit on the mountain. Occasionally a hiker would get lost and stumble onto my property, but mostly I lived in blessed isolation, just me, my guilt, and the bottle of bourbon that helped me sleep most nights. I'd turned this place into a fortress against feeling. Boarded up windows I didn't need, let the garden Emma would have loved grow wild with weeds. The only creatures I wanted around were the ones that stayed in the forest where they belonged. A man needs his boundaries. Needs to know where the hurt stops and the healing might begin. But boundaries, I was learning, don't mean much to a mother with a dying child. That March day when I'd saved the injured retriever, pulled him right out of the road after some fool tourist clipped him, I thought I was just being decent. The dog lived, found his way back to his family, and I went back to my solitude. Didn't think twice about it, didn't know I was being watched, studied, judged worthy by eyes that reflected moonlight and saw straight through a man's soul. "You can't run from who you are forever," Emma used to say when I'd get stubborn about something. "Eventually life finds a way to remind you." Standing there at 3:47 in the morning, staring at a mother raccoon who'd somehow found her way to my door with her dying baby, I was beginning to understand what she meant. Some things chase you down, no matter how far you run. Some responsibilities find you even when you're hiding from the world. The cub's breathing was so shallow I could barely see its tiny ribs move. Time was running out, and somehow this wild mother knew I was her only hope. 7 days earlier, I'd made a decision that seemed reasonable at the time, logical even. The kind of decision a man makes when he's tired of sharing his space with creatures that don't belong there. I'd been finding evidence of them everywhere, tiny paw prints in the mud around my water spigot, scattered garbage from my outdoor trash can, even small holes dug near my foundation where they'd been searching for grubs. The raccoons had been getting bolder, and I was getting fed up. "Enough is enough," I muttered to myself that Tuesday morning, driving into Millbrook with a purpose I hadn't felt in months. The hardware store clerk, a kid who couldn't have been more than 20, looked at me funny when I asked for the strongest rat poison they carried. "You got a real problem out there, mister?" he asked, scanning the boxes of decon like they were ammunition. "Just taking care of business," I replied, avoiding his eyes. "Sometimes you gotta be firm about your boundaries." The irony of those words would haunt me later. Emma always said I was too soft-hearted for my own good, that I'd give shelter to any stray that wandered onto our property. She used to tease me about it. "Tommy Walker, you're like St. Francis with a veterinary degree." But grief has a way of hardening a man's heart, turning kindness into something brittle and sharp. Back at the cabin, I spread those poison boxes around the perimeter like I was laying siege to my own property. Under the porch, near the garbage cans, around the foundation, anywhere those masked bandits might think to venture. I told myself I was protecting my peace, my solitude, my right to be left alone with my ghosts. "Every life has purpose, Tommy." Emma's voice drifted through my memory as I placed the last box near the old oak tree. I pushed the thought away, focusing instead on the task at hand. Some purposes were more important than others, and my purpose right now was keeping the wilderness where it belonged, away from me. I remember standing back, surveying my handiwork with something that felt like satisfaction. The perimeter was secure, the message was clear: no trespassing, not even for creatures who didn't know how to read. That evening, as the sun painted the mountains purple and gold, I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee gone cold, watching the tree line for movement. Sure enough, just as dusk settled into full darkness, I caught sight of them, a family of raccoons emerging from the forest edge, mother and two cubs moving with that distinctive waddle toward my property. I watched them approach the first poison station, the mother sniffing cautiously at the unfamiliar scent. Something in her posture reminded me of Emma when she was being extra careful with Sophie, that protective tension of a mother sensing danger but not yet understanding its source. "Turn around," I whispered into the cooling air. "Just turn around and find somewhere else to cause trouble." But they didn't turn around. The mother seemed to consider the strange boxes for a long moment, then guided her cubs away from them, toward the water spigot they'd been visiting for weeks. I felt a moment of grudging respect for her intelligence. She knew something wasn't right, even if she couldn't identify the exact threat. Smart girl, I admitted to myself, but not smart enough. Over the following days, I noticed the raccoon family's visits becoming less frequent. I told myself this was exactly what I wanted. Problem solved, boundaries respected, mission accomplished. I didn't think about where they might be getting water now, or whether they'd found another food source, or if they were struggling to adapt to the new reality I'd created. On Friday, I found one of the bait boxes disturbed, its contents partially consumed. Something had gotten hungry enough or desperate enough to ignore whatever instincts had kept it away. I felt a flicker of something, regret, concern, but I pushed it down. This was the natural order of things, survival of the fittest, the strong teaching the weak to respect boundaries. "You can't save everyone," I told myself, echoing words a fellow veterinarian had said to me years ago after we'd lost a particularly difficult case. "Sometimes the kindest thing is to let nature take its course." But even as I said it, I heard Emma's voice cutting through my rationalization. "Since when did you start deciding who deserves to live and who doesn't, Thomas Walker?" Saturday brought rain, washing the mountain clean and filling the air with the scent of pine and wet earth. I spent the day inside, trying to write in the journal my grief counselor had recommended, trying to make sense of the 3 years since I'd lost everything that mattered. The words wouldn't come. They never did anymore. Sunday was quiet, too quiet. I realized I hadn't seen any sign of the raccoon family since Tuesday, and for the first time since placing those poison boxes, I felt a gnawing unease in my stomach. I told myself they'd simply moved on to easier pickings, found a new territory where they didn't have to navigate around human interference. But Monday morning I found another box disturbed, this time nearly empty. Standing there in the gray dawn light, staring at the evidence of what I'd set in motion, I felt something shift inside my chest. A weight I hadn't realized I was carrying suddenly felt heavier, more oppressive. The silence that had felt like peace now seemed ominous, pregnant with consequences I wasn't ready to face. "What have you done, Tommy?" Emma's voice whispered through the pine-scented air. I didn't have an answer then. I wouldn't have an answer for another week, when those consequences would come scratching at my door in the form of a mother's desperate love and a tiny life hanging by a thread. 7 days later, staring into those dark, wet eyes on my porch, I would finally understand the true meaning of the phrase, "You reap what you sow." And I would discover that sometimes, when you think you're protecting yourself from the world, you're actually destroying the very thing that might save you. Standing there in my doorway at nearly 4 in the morning, staring at this impossible scene, I felt like I was having a conversation with a ghost. Not the kind that haunts old houses, but the kind that lives in your memory and won't let you forget who you used to be. "What am I supposed to do here, Em?" I whispered into the darkness, half expecting her voice to carry back on the mountain wind. The mother raccoon hadn't moved. She sat perfectly still, watching me with those intelligent eyes that seemed to hold more understanding than any wild animal had a right to possess. Her baby lay motionless on the weathered porch boards, and I could see now that something was terribly wrong. The cub's breathing was shallow and irregular, its little body convulsing slightly every few seconds. I knelt down slowly, the way I used to approach frightened animals in my practice. "Easy, Mama," I murmured, my voice rusty from disuse. "Let me take a look." She didn't back away. Didn't growl or show her teeth. Just watched as I gently examined her baby without touching it, relying on observation skills I thought I'd buried along with my stethoscope. What I saw made my blood run cold. The symptoms were unmistakable. Labored breathing, muscle tremors, the peculiar way the cub's tiny paws were curled. I'd seen these signs before, years ago, when farmers would bring in dogs that had gotten into rat poison. The realization hit me like a physical blow, driving the air from my lungs. "Oh, Jesus," I breathed. "Oh, sweet Jesus, what have I done?" The mother raccoon tilted her head at my words, and I swear I saw something flicker in her expression. A question, maybe, or recognition that I finally understood. My hands began to shake as the full weight of it crashed over me. This wasn't some random tragedy. This wasn't nature taking its course or survival of the fittest. This was my doing, my poison. My choice to draw lines in the sand with death as the consequence. "You can't unring a bell," Emma's voice echoed in my memory. She'd said that to me once when I'd made a harsh comment about a difficult client, words that hurt more than I'd intended. "Once something's said or done, Tommy, you can't take it back. You can only try to make it right. But how do you make this right? How do you undo a week of toxins coursing through a tiny body? How do you explain to a mother that the man she'd trusted with her baby's life was the same man who'd poisoned him in the first place?" I looked up at her again, this wild mother who'd somehow chosen me as her last hope, and felt shame burn through me like acid. She was giving me the kind of trust I didn't deserve, the kind I'd stopped believing in after Emma and Sophie died. Absolute, desperate faith that I would do everything in my power to save what mattered most to her. "I don't know if I can fix this," I told her honestly, my veterinarian training warring with 3 years of self-imposed exile from caring. "I don't know if I remember how." She made a soft sound then, not quite a chirp, but not quite a whimper, something between a question and a plea. And suddenly I was 8 years old again, standing in my grandfather's barn while he worked on a horse with colic, watching those steady hands and learning that healing wasn't about being certain. It was about showing up when everything was uncertain and trying anyway. "All right," I said, more to myself than to her. "All right, let's see what we can do." I scooped up the cub as gently as I could, feeling how light it was, how fragile. The mother followed me inside without hesitation, padding across my threshold like she belonged there, like this had always been the plan. Maybe it had been. Maybe she'd been watching me longer than I knew, waiting for the right moment to test whether there was anything left of the man who used to save lives for a living. My hands moved on autopilot, muscle memory from 1,000 emergencies taking over while my brain struggled to catch up. Warm towels from the dryer, a heating pad on low, a small bowl of sugar water mixed with salt. The closest thing I had to oral rehydration solution without my old supplies. The cub's pulse was thready and weak when I found it, barely perceptible under my fingertip. But it was there, still fighting, still holding on to whatever spark of life hadn't been poisoned out of its tiny body. "Come on, little one," I whispered, the endearment slipping out before I could stop it. I hadn't used that tone in 3 years, not since Sophie. "Come on, don't you give up on me now." The mother raccoon positioned herself where she could see everything I was doing, never taking her eyes off her baby. There was something almost human in her vigil, a quality of attention that reminded me painfully of Emma sitting beside Sophie's hospital bed those last few days, refusing to leave, refusing to accept that some things couldn't be fought. I tried to give the cub a few drops of sugar water, but its swallowing reflex was too weak. The liquid just pooled in its mouth, threatening to drown it rather than help. My frustration mounted as I realized how limited my options were without proper medical equipment, without the tools and medications that might actually make a difference. "I need help," I admitted to the silent room. "I can't do this alone." The admission felt like surrender, like breaking a promise I'd made to myself about self-reliance and not depending on anyone ever again. But looking at this dying baby and its mother who'd placed her faith in me, I knew my pride was a luxury neither of them could afford. I reached for my old cell phone, the one I kept charged but rarely used, and scrolled through contacts I hadn't called in years. Most of them were probably asleep, and none of them would appreciate being woken by the hermit who'd walked away from his responsibilities without explanation. But sometimes a man has to swallow his pride and ask for grace he doesn't deserve. My finger hovered over Dr. Sarah Chen's number. She'd taken over my practice when I left, had been trying to reach out for months before finally giving up. She had every right to hang up on me. Every right to tell me to handle my own problems like a grown man. But she also had the knowledge and resources that might save this little life. "The road to hell is paved with good intentions," I muttered, echoing something my father used to say when I'd mess up despite trying to do right. Well, I'd paved my road. Now I had to find a way to turn around and walk back toward redemption, even if it meant admitting I'd been wrong about everything. The mother raccoon was still watching me, still waiting with that terrible patience of a parent who knows they've done everything they can and now must trust others to finish what they started. "Hang on, Mama," I told her, dialing Sarah's number with trembling fingers. "Help's coming. At least I hope to God it is." What I didn't know, what I couldn't have imagined in my wildest dreams, was that this mother raccoon had been studying me for 6 months. Not just watching, but analyzing, evaluating, deciding whether I was worthy of the trust she was about to place in me. It started back in March, on a day that seemed unremarkable at the time. I'd been driving back from one of my rare trips to town when I spotted the golden retriever lying in the middle of Route 220, blood matting his fur, his hind legs twisted at an unnatural angle. Some fool tourist had clipped him and kept on driving. leaving this beautiful animal to die alone on the asphalt. I should have driven past. Should have minded my own business, stayed in my lane, kept my head down like I'd been doing for 3 years. That's what the bitter, broken version of Thomas Walker would have done. But something about the way that dog looked at me, resigned but still hoping, cracked something open in my chest that I thought had calcified beyond repair. I pulled over and spent the next hour in the middle of that backcountry road, using my old emergency kit to stabilize fractures I hadn't treated since my practicing days. The dog never bit me, never struggled, just lay there trusting while I worked to piece him back together. His tag said Buster, and his owner's phone number was worn but still readable. What I didn't see was the mother raccoon perched in the oak tree 30 yards away, watching every move I made. Taking notes, you might say, in whatever way raccoons take notes about the character of the humans they encounter. Over the following weeks, she began what I can only describe as reconnaissance missions. I'd catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, a shadow by the trash cans, a rustle in the bushes near my porch. At first, I thought it was just typical raccoon behavior, opportunistic scavenging in a territory they were testing for weaknesses. But this was different, deliberate. She wasn't just looking for food or shelter, she was studying me. I discovered later that she'd witnessed me leaving water out for the stray cats that sometimes wandered through, saw me gently relocate a family of possums that had taken up residence under my porch instead of calling animal control to have them removed, watched me spend 20 minutes one evening helping a young deer that had gotten tangled in some old fencing, talking softly to calm it while I worked the wire free. Each act of kindness was a test I didn't know I was taking. "Trust ain't given, it's earned," my grandfather used to say when he was teaching me about working with animals. And some creatures, they've got to see your heart before they'll show you theirs. This mother raccoon had seen my heart during those unguarded moments when I thought nobody was watching. She'd cataloged my responses to suffering, measured my patience with frightened creatures, evaluated my willingness to help even when there was nothing in it for me. But it was the incident with the baby bird that sealed her decision. Late in May, a violent storm had torn through the mountains, leaving broken branches and debris scattered across my property. I was cleaning up the damage when I heard it, a tiny peeping sound coming from somewhere near the old maple tree. High above, I could see a nest that had been partially destroyed, but the sound was coming from ground level. I found the baby cardinal nestled in a pile of wet leaves, too young to fly, soaked and shivering from the rain. Its mother was nowhere to be seen, probably killed in the storm or driven away by the chaos. The logical thing would have been to leave it alone, let nature take its course, except that not every creature could be saved. Instead, I spent the next 3 hours rigging up a makeshift incubator using a shoebox, heating pad, and desk lamp. Fed it sugar water with an eyedropper every 30 minutes. Kept it warm and dry while it slowly recovered from its ordeal. The mother raccoon watched all of this from her hiding place in the forest edge, watched me get up every 2 hours that night to check on the tiny bird, watched me research online how to care for orphaned cardinals, what they needed to survive and eventually thrive. When the bird was strong enough to fledge a week later, I carried the box outside and opened it near the maple tree. The little cardinal hopped onto the edge, tested its wings, then flew up into the branches where it belonged. I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, a sense of completion, of having contributed something positive to the world instead of just taking up space in it. That's when she made her decision. The mother raccoon had 2 cubs that spring, born in a den she'd carved out of a fallen log about half a mile from my cabin. She was a good mother, patient, protective, teaching them how to forage and stay safe in a world full of predators and human dangers. But she was also a practical mother, the kind who understood that sometimes survival meant taking calculated risks. Throughout the summer, she began bringing her cubs closer to my property. Not close enough to trigger the motion sensor lights or alert me to their presence, but close enough to observe my daily routines. She learned when I went to bed, when I woke up, how I responded to different situations. She saw me place those poison boxes. I'll never know exactly what went through her mind in that moment, but I imagine it was something like the calculation any parent makes when weighing risks against benefits. She knew the boxes were dangerous, her nose would have told her that immediately, but she also knew something about my character that I'd forgotten about myself. She knew I was a healer, so when her baby got into that poison despite her best efforts to keep him away from it, when she realized he was dying and there was nothing she could do with her own limited resources, she made a choice that defied every instinct evolution had given her. She chose to trust the same human whose carelessness had caused the problem in the first place. The irony wasn't lost on her, I'm sure. But desperation has a way of clarifying priorities, and her priority was clear. Save her baby, no matter what it cost her in terms of pride or safety. So she gathered her dying cub in her mouth and began the journey to my front door, carrying not just her baby, but 6 months' worth of careful observation, 6 months of testing my character when I thought nobody was paying attention. She'd seen me at my best during those unguarded moments of compassion. Now she was betting her baby's life that the man who'd saved Buster, who'd helped the tangled deer, who'd stayed up all night caring for an orphaned bird, was still in there somewhere beneath 3 years of grief and self-imposed isolation. She was trusting that love could overcome pride, that healing instincts could overcome despair, that the doctor in me was stronger than the hermit I'd become. As I held her poisoned baby in my hands that night, trying to remember everything I'd once known about emergency veterinary care, I realized she'd been more faithful to my true nature than I had been myself. She'd seen who I really was, even when I'd forgotten. And now she was giving me the chance to remember. The phone rang 4 times before Sarah's groggy voice answered. "This better be life or death because it's 4:30 in the morning." "Sarah, it's Tom Walker." The silence stretched so long I thought she'd hung up. "I need your help. I've got a dying raccoon cub, anticoagulant poisoning, and I'm in way over my head." "Tom?" Her voice sharpened with disbelief. "Tom Walker? The Tom Walker who disappeared 3 years ago without so much as a goodbye note? That Tom Walker?" "I know I've got no right to ask." "You're damn right you don't." The hurt in her voice cut deeper than anger would have. "Do you have any idea what you left behind? The clients who trusted you, the animals that needed you, the people who cared about you?" The mother raccoon was watching me intently, and I could swear she understood every word. Her baby's breathing had become even more labored in the few minutes since I'd made the call. "Sarah, please." "I'll explain everything later, but right now there's a baby dying in my hands, and you're the only person within 50 miles who knows enough to help me save him." Another pause. I could hear her moving around, probably getting dressed. "What are the symptoms?" I rattled off everything I was seeing, the respiratory distress, the muscle tremors, the way the cub's gums had taken on a grayish pallor. With each detail, I felt some of my old confidence returning, the clinical assessment skills that had once been as natural as breathing. "Sounds like brodifacoum or diphethiolone," she said. All business now. "How long since exposure?" "Best guess, 5 to 7 days. "Jesus, Tom. That's a long time for something that small. What do you have for treatment?" I looked around my kitchen, taking inventory of supplies that seemed pathetically inadequate. Sugar water, heating pad, some old towels, that's about it. "Okay, listen carefully. You need to keep him warm and hydrated, but don't force fluids if he can't swallow properly. You'll just aspirate him. I'm grabbing my emergency kit and some vitamin K, but it's going to take me 45 minutes to get up there." "He might not have 45 minutes. Then you better start remembering how to be a doctor instead of whatever you've been playing at for the past 3 years." The line went dead. And I was alone again with 2 raccoons and a crisis that was spiraling beyond my ability to control it. The mother hadn't moved from her position near the cub, but I could see the tension in her small body, the way her ears swiveled at every sound he made. I tried to give him another few drops of sugar water, but his swallowing reflex was getting weaker. Each shallow breath seemed like it might be his last, and I found myself falling into the familiar rhythm of emergency medicine, constant monitoring, micro-adjustments, fighting for every second while hoping it would be enough. "Come on, little guy," I whispered, gently massaging his tiny chest to stimulate circulation. "Your mama didn't bring you all this way just to give up now." But even as I said it, I could feel him slipping away. His heartbeat was becoming irregular, his breathing more shallow. The poison had been working through his system for days, destroying his blood's ability to clot, causing internal bleeding that I couldn't see but could certainly measure in his declining vital signs. At 5:15 a.m., just as the eastern sky was beginning to show the first hint of dawn, the cub's breathing stopped. I immediately began CPR, using 2 fingers to compress his tiny chest, trying to remember the rate and depth that might work on something weighing less than a pound. The mother raccoon made a sound I'd never heard before, a keening wail that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. "Not yet," I said through gritted teeth, continuing compressions. "We're not giving up yet." I gave him rescue breaths, my mouth covering his tiny muzzle, breathing life into lungs that had already begun to shut down. 15 compressions, 2 breaths, 15 compressions, 2 breaths. The rhythm of trying to cheat death, 1 heartbeat at a time. For 3 minutes that felt like hours, I worked over that small body while his mother watched in silence. My hands were shaking, my own breathing ragged from adrenaline and desperation. This wasn't just about saving a raccoon anymore. This was about whether I still had the right to call myself a healer, whether there was anything left of the man Emma had fallen in love with. Then, impossibly, I felt it, a flutter under my fingertips, weak, irregular, but definitely a heartbeat. The cub took a gasping breath, then another. His eyes remained closed, but his chest began rising and falling on its own again. The mother raccoon moved closer, sniffing gently at her baby, making soft, chittering sounds that sounded like prayers answered. "That's it," I breathed, hardly daring to believe it. "That's my boy. Stay with us now." But the relief was short-lived. Even as I watched, I could see signs that his condition was deteriorating in other ways. His gums were pale, almost white, and there were tiny hemorrhages visible in his eyes. The internal bleeding was getting worse, and without proper medical intervention, bringing him back from cardiac arrest might have been nothing more than prolonging his suffering. I needed Sarah to get here. I needed equipment I didn't have, medications I couldn't provide, expertise that 3 years of self-imposed exile had made rusty and uncertain. But most of all, I needed to believe that some things were still worth fighting for, even when the odds were impossibly stacked against success. The mother raccoon settled beside me then, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her small body. She looked up at me with those dark, intelligent eyes, and I saw something there that nearly broke me. Gratitude mixed with acceptance, love mixed with the terrible patience of a parent who knows they've done everything possible and must now trust others to finish what they started. "I won't let him suffer," I promised her quietly. "Whatever happens, I won't let him hurt any more than he already has." She seemed to understand, settling into a watchful stillness that reminded me of Emma during those final hospital vigils. The kind of presence that says, "I'm here, I'm not leaving, and whatever comes next, we'll face it together." Outside, I could hear Sarah's truck grinding up the mountain road, headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. Help was coming, but whether it would arrive in time remained to be seen. The next few hours would determine whether this desperate midnight journey would end in salvation or heartbreak. Either way, I realized there was no going back to the man I'd been yesterday. The hermit who'd placed those poison boxes, who'd thought he could wall himself off from caring, who'd believed that isolation was safer than connection. That man was gone forever. In his place sat someone I barely recognized but dimly remembered. A doctor holding a dying baby, while its mother trusted him with the most precious thing in her world. For the first time in 3 years, I felt like I might be coming home to myself. Sarah arrived like a whirlwind in scrubs and determination, her emergency kit slung over her shoulder and 3 years' worth of suppressed anger written across her face. She took one look at the scene in my kitchen. Me hunched over a dying raccoon cub while its mother watched from 2 feet away, and her expression shifted from fury to professional focus. "Jesus Christ, Tom, what have you gotten yourself into?" She knelt beside me, immediately checking the cub's vitals with practiced efficiency. "And why isn't Mama attacking us right now?" "Long story," I said, my voice hoarse from hours of stress. "How bad is it?" Sarah's hands moved over the tiny body with the same gentle precision I remembered from our residency days. We'd worked together for 2 years before I'd taken over old Doc Henderson's practice, and I'd always admired her clinical instincts. Now I was grateful for them. "Bad," she said simply. "Severe anemia, internal bleeding, probably multiple organ involvement. His blood work would look like a horror show if we had time to run it." She looked up at me with eyes that held no comfort. "Tom, you need to prepare yourself. Even with everything I've brought, this little guy is hanging by a thread." The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd been holding on to hope, telling myself that my crude attempts at stabilization might be enough until real help arrived. But Sarah's assessment stripped away any illusions I might have had about the severity of the situation. "What can we do?" I asked, hating how desperate I sounded. She was already drawing up medications from vials in her kit. Vitamin K to help his blood clot, subcutaneous fluids to address dehydration, maybe some prednisolone to reduce inflammation. "But, Tom," she paused, meeting my eyes directly. "With this level of toxicity, we might just be prolonging his suffering." The mother raccoon made a soft sound, almost like she was responding to Sarah's words. She moved closer to her baby, gently nuzzling his tiny head with her nose. The gesture was so tender, so human in its maternal desperation, that I felt tears I'd been holding back finally spill over. "She trusts us," I said, my voice breaking. "She brought him to me because she trusts us to help him." Sarah looked at the mother raccoon for a long moment, something shifting in her expression. "In 20 years of veterinary medicine, I've never seen anything like this. Wild mothers don't bring their babies to humans. They just don't." As she worked, administering tiny injections and setting up a makeshift IV line, I found myself slipping into memories of another small patient, another desperate fight against impossible odds. Sophie had been in the ICU for 6 days after the accident, hooked up to machines that breathed for her, pumped medications into her small body, monitored every heartbeat while Emma and I took turns at her bedside. The doctors had been honest with us from the beginning. "Prepare yourselves for the worst," they'd said. "Sometimes love isn't enough." But we'd fought anyway, the way parents fight when fighting is all they have left. We'd talked to her, read stories, played her favorite songs, held her hand and willed her to come back to us. For 6 days, we'd lived on hope and denial and the terrible arithmetic of medical crises, heartbeat by heartbeat, breath by breath, hour by hour. On the 7th day, the machines had started alarming. Sophie's blood pressure had dropped, her brain activity had flatlined, and all our hope had shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The doctors had used gentle words like letting go, and peaceful transition. But what they meant was that our baby girl was dying and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. I'd held her hand as they turned off the machines, felt her fingers go slack in mine, watched the light fade from eyes that had once sparkled with mischief and joy. Emma had collapsed against my chest, sobbing with a grief so raw it seemed to tear holes in the fabric of reality itself. "Don't you dare give up on us now," I whispered to the raccoon cub, the same words I'd said to Sophie in those final moments. "Don't you dare!" Sarah had finished her initial treatment and was monitoring the cub's response. For a few minutes his breathing seemed to stabilize, and I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe the medications would be enough. Maybe we'd caught it in time. Maybe this story would have a different ending than the one that had destroyed my world 3 years ago. Then the convulsions started. The cub's tiny body began seizing, his muscles contracting violently as the poison continued its assault on his nervous system. Sarah immediately drew up an anticonvulsant, but even as she administered it, I could see in her eyes that we were losing ground. "This is what I was afraid of," she said quietly. "The toxin levels are too high. His system can't handle it." The mother raccoon moved closer, her soft chittering becoming more urgent. She seemed to understand that something terrible was happening, that her baby was slipping away despite everything we were trying to do. The sound she made then will haunt me for the rest of my life. A mother's lament that transcended species, a grief so pure and desperate, it seemed to fill the entire room. "Tom," Sarah said gently, her hand on my shoulder. "I think it's time to consider—" "No." The word came out harsher than I'd intended. "Not yet. There has to be something else we can try." But even as I said it, I could see the cub's condition deteriorating rapidly. His breathing became irregular again, his heartbeat thready and weak. The seizures had stopped, but only because his nervous system was shutting down. We were watching him die in slow motion, and there was nothing our training or experience or desperate love could do to change that outcome. The mother raccoon suddenly did something extraordinary. She moved directly next to her baby and began grooming him with her tongue, the same way she probably had when he was first born. Her movements were gentle, methodical, purposeful, as if she was preparing him for a journey she couldn't take with him. "Oh God," I breathed, recognizing the behavior. "She's saying goodbye." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she watched the tender scene. "Tom, sometimes the kindest thing—" "I know." I couldn't get any other words out past the grief clogging my throat. "I know." But knowing and accepting are two different things. Sitting there in my kitchen at dawn, watching a mother prepare to lose her baby while I stood helpless to prevent it, I felt every bit of pain I'd tried to bury over the past 3 years come roaring back to the surface. I'd thought moving to the mountains would insulate me from this kind of loss. I'd thought isolation would protect me from having to watch helpless while something precious slipped away. But love doesn't respect boundaries, and grief doesn't honor walls we build around our hearts. The cub took 3 more shallow breaths, each one weaker than the last. His mother continued her gentle grooming, her own breathing synchronized with his as if she could somehow share her life force with him. And then, at 6:47 a.m., as the first rays of sunlight began filtering through my kitchen window, he simply stopped breathing. This time, there was no flutter of heartbeat, no gasp of returning consciousness, just stillness, final, absolute, irreversible stillness. The mother raccoon stopped grooming and sat back on her haunches, looking down at her baby with an expression I'll never forget. Not confusion or denial, but the terrible clarity of a mother who has lost everything that mattered most to her. She looked up at me then, and in her dark eyes I saw my own reflection, another parent who had failed to save what he loved most, another soul broken by the arithmetic of loss. We sat there together in the growing light, three beings united by grief and the crushing weight of love that outlasts life itself. For several minutes we sat in complete silence. The morning light streaming through my kitchen window illuminated the small, still form on my table, and I felt something inside me break that had been barely holding together for 3 years. Sarah reached over and gently closed the cub's eyes, her own face wet with tears. "I'm sorry, Tom," she whispered. "We did everything we could." But the mother raccoon wasn't finished with us yet. She suddenly stood up, looked directly at me with those intelligent dark eyes, and made a sound I'd never heard before, a sharp chittering that seemed urgent, almost commanding. Then she did something that defied everything I thought I knew about wild animal behavior. She tugged gently at my sleeve with her tiny paw and started moving toward the door. "What's she doing?" Sarah asked, wiping her eyes. The mother raccoon stopped, looked back at us, then repeated the gesture, pulling at my shirt, moving toward the door, looking back again. The message was unmistakable. She wanted us to follow her. "Tom, this is highly unusual behavior," Sarah said, but I was already standing up. Something in the raccoon's manner told me this wasn't over, that there was more to this story than the tragedy we'd just witnessed. "She wants to show us something," I said, moving slowly toward the door. "After everything she's been through, after trusting us with her baby, I think we owe it to her to listen." Sarah gathered her medical supplies while I grabbed a flashlight, though the morning light was growing stronger. The mother raccoon waited patiently by the door, and when we stepped outside, she immediately began leading us into the forest behind my cabin. She moved with purpose, stopping occasionally to make sure we were following, but never hurrying. There was something almost ceremonial about the way she navigated through the trees, taking a specific path that seemed meaningful to her. After about 10 minutes of walking, she led us to a rocky outcropping I'd never explored before, about half a mile from my house. At the base of the largest boulder was a small cave opening, partially hidden by fallen branches and undergrowth. The mother raccoon stopped and called out, not the urgent chittering from before, but a series of soft sounds that seemed like a greeting or announcement. And then, to my absolute amazement, something moved in the shadows of the cave. "Jesus Christ," Sarah breathed beside me. 3 small shapes emerged from the cave entrance, animals I recognized immediately but couldn't quite believe I was seeing. A young opossum, moving sluggishly, its fur matted and eyes dull. A juvenile squirrel that could barely lift its head, and behind them, barely visible in the shadows, what looked like a young fox, all of them showing the same symptoms I'd just witnessed in the raccoon cub. "Tom," Sarah grabbed my arm, her voice tight with understanding. "These animals are all poisoned. They're all dying from the same thing that killed her baby." The mother raccoon moved between us and the sick animals, but not defensively. Instead, she looked up at me with an expression that seemed to say, "Now you understand. This isn't just about my baby. This is about all of them." I felt the world tilt beneath my feet as the full scope of what I'd done crashed over me. The poison I'd placed around my property hadn't just affected one raccoon family, it had created a cascade of suffering that had spread throughout the local ecosystem. These animals had either eaten the poison bait directly or consumed prey that had been contaminated. "How many?" I asked the mother raccoon, as if she could answer in words. "How many are there?" She led us deeper into the cave where we found 2 more victims, a young rabbit and another opossum, both in the final stages of anticoagulant poisoning. Sarah immediately began examining them, her professional instincts taking over even in the face of this overwhelming tragedy. "Tom, these animals need immediate treatment if we're going to save any of them," she said, but her voice held a note of despair. "The amount of medication required, the time, the facilities we'd need, I don't know if it's even possible." I knelt beside the young fox, who raised his head slightly at my approach. His eyes held the same glazed look I'd seen in the raccoon cub, the distant gaze of a creature fighting a battle his body was losing. When I reached out slowly, he didn't pull away. He was too weak to be afraid. "How long have you been trying to save them?" I asked the mother raccoon. She couldn't answer, but I could piece together the story from what I was seeing. She'd been gathering the sick and dying, bringing them to this sheltered place, trying to care for them the only way she knew how. When her own baby had fallen victim to the same poison, she'd made the desperate decision to seek human help. "She's been running a wildlife hospital," Sarah said, the wonder clear in her voice. "A wild raccoon has been trying to save every animal affected by your poison." The weight of that realization nearly drove me to my knees. This mother hadn't just lost her own baby to my carelessness. She'd been watching other creatures suffer and die one by one, and had been powerless to help them, until she decided to trust the very human who had caused their suffering in the first place. "Why?" I asked her, knowing she couldn't answer but needing to voice the question anyway. "Why would you trust me with this? Why would you show me what I've done?" But even as I asked it, I thought I understood. She wasn't just asking me to witness the consequences of my actions. She was giving me a chance to fix them, to be part of the solution instead of just the problem. "Sarah," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "what would we need to treat all of them?" She looked around at the collection of suffering animals, her mind clearly calculating supplies, time, logistics, massive amounts of vitamin K, IV fluids, constant monitoring, supportive care around the clock. "Tom, we're talking about essentially setting up a field hospital for wildlife." "Then that's what we do." "Tom, be realistic. This would take weeks, maybe months. The cost alone—" "I don't care about the cost." The words came out with a force that surprised even me. "These animals are dying because of choices I made. I put that poison out there, and now I'm going to do everything in my power to undo the damage." The mother raccoon was watching our exchange intently, and when I made my declaration, she moved closer to me. For a moment I thought she might actually touch me, but instead she did something even more remarkable. She gently picked up a small twig in her mouth and placed it at my feet. Sarah looked confused, but I understood immediately. In many cultures, the offering of a branch or twig is a symbol of peace, of alliance, of working together toward a common goal. This wild mother was formally accepting my help, acknowledging that we were now partners in trying to save the lives that hung in the balance. "All right," Sarah said, pulling out her phone to start making calls. "I'm going to need to contact the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center in Charlottesville, see if they can spare some volunteers and supplies. This is going to be the most insane veterinary project I've ever attempted." As she began organizing what would become an unprecedented rescue operation, I knelt beside each of the poisoned animals, gently examining them, assessing their conditions, making mental notes about what each one would need to survive. The mother raccoon positioned herself where she could see all of them, continuing her vigil over creatures that weren't even her own species. She had appointed herself their guardian, and now she had recruited me to be their healer. It was then that I realized this had been her plan all along. Bringing me her dying baby hadn't just been about saving one life, it had been about testing whether I was worthy of helping save them all. She had needed to know if the man who had caused this tragedy was capable of becoming the man who could fix it. "Actions speak louder than words," I murmured, remembering something Emma used to say when I'd promised to change some habit or behavior. "Actions speak louder than words." The mother raccoon tilted her head at my words, and I could swear I saw approval in her dark eyes. The real work was just beginning. What followed was the most exhausting and rewarding month of my life since before the accident. Sarah made good on her promise to contact the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, and within hours, my isolated mountain cabin had transformed into something resembling a field hospital for poisoned wildlife. Dr. Jennifer Martinez arrived from Charlottesville with 2 volunteers and enough medical supplies to stock a small clinic. She took one look at the situation: 7 critically ill wild animals and a mother raccoon who refused to leave their side, and shook her head in amazement. "In 30 years of wildlife rehabilitation, I've never seen anything like this," she told me as we set up IV lines and monitoring equipment in my living room. "That mother raccoon has essentially been running triage on animals that aren't even her species." The first 72 hours were touch and go. We lost the young rabbit despite our best efforts, and for a moment I thought the mother raccoon might give up on the entire enterprise. But she surprised me again by gently grooming the small body before allowing us to remove it, then immediately returning her attention to the survivors. The fox, who we'd started calling Rusty because of his burnt orange coat, responded better than anyone expected. By the end of the first week, he was taking food on his own and showing the first signs of his natural wariness returning. The opossums were slower to recover, but their vital signs gradually stabilized as the poison worked its way out of their systems. But it was the young squirrel who became our miracle case. Sarah had been ready to recommend euthanasia. His condition was so severe that recovery seemed impossible, but the mother raccoon refused to give up on him. She would sit beside his enclosure for hours, making soft, chittering sounds that seemed to encourage him to keep fighting. On day 10, he opened his eyes and ate a small piece of apple from my hand. "Well, I'll be damned," Sarah said, watching the squirrel groom himself with shaky but determined movements. "That raccoon knows something about healing that they don't teach in veterinary school." As the animals recovered, I found myself remembering what it felt like to be useful again. Getting up before dawn to check on patients, adjusting medications based on subtle changes in behavior, celebrating small victories like a successful meal or an increase in activity level. It all felt like coming home to a part of myself I thought I'd lost forever. Emma's voice seemed to whisper through the house during those long days of healing. "This is who you are, Tommy. This is who you've always been." The mother raccoon never left us during the entire recovery period. She appointed herself head nurse, supervisor, and emotional support for every animal in our makeshift hospital. She would move from enclosure to enclosure, checking on each patient, somehow knowing which ones needed encouragement and which ones needed space to rest. But perhaps more importantly, she kept watch over me. I caught her observing me during the difficult moments, when the rabbit died, when I doubted my ability to help the others, when the weight of guilt threatened to overwhelm my determination to make things right. During those times, she would position herself where I could see her, a silent reminder that healing is a partnership between those who care and those who need care. 3 weeks into the recovery process, something extraordinary happened. I was sitting on my porch at sunset taking a rare break from patient monitoring when the mother raccoon approached me with something in her mouth. She set it down carefully at my feet, then stepped back and waited. It was a perfect acorn, polished smooth by handling, with no cracks or blemishes anywhere on its surface. In the natural world, such offerings are rare and meaningful, a gift that says, "You are accepted, you are forgiven, you are part of our family now." I picked up the acorn with trembling hands, feeling its weight and warmth, understanding that this simple gesture represented something far more significant than gratitude. This was absolution from the very creature I had wronged most deeply. This was forgiveness I didn't deserve but desperately needed. "Thank you," I whispered, and she chittered softly in response before settling beside me on the porch steps. We sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the mountains gold and purple, listening to the sounds of healing animals stirring in the house behind us. For the first time in 3 years, I felt something I'd thought was lost forever: peace. By the end of the month, 5 of the 7 animals were ready for release back into the wild. We held the ceremony at dawn, opening cages and watching as each creature tested its freedom, remembered its wildness, and gradually made its way back into the forest where it belonged. The mother raccoon supervised each release, following the recovered animals to the edge of my property before returning to watch the next one go free. When the last opossum disappeared into the trees, she sat down and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as satisfaction, the look of a job well done. But our partnership wasn't over. Word of what we'd accomplished spread through the network of wildlife rehabilitators, veterinarians, and animal control officers throughout Virginia. Within weeks, I was getting calls about other wildlife emergencies: injured raptors, orphaned deer, animals affected by habitat destruction or human carelessness. Sarah suggested I apply for the proper permits to operate as a licensed wildlife rehabilitation facility. "You've got the skills, the space, and apparently the best assistant in the business," she said, gesturing toward the mother raccoon who had become a permanent resident of the property. 6 months later, the Walker Wildlife Sanctuary was officially open for business. The wooden sign at the end of my driveway read, "Where Second Chances Begin," and below that, in smaller letters, "Founded in partnership with Hope." Hope was the name I'd given to the mother raccoon, though she'd always been Hope to me from that first night when she'd brought her dying baby to my door. She had given me hope when I'd forgotten what it felt like. She had shown me that love doesn't end with loss. It transforms into something larger, more purposeful, more healing than anything I could have imagined. A year after that first desperate encounter, I was sitting on my porch with Hope curled up in my lap when I heard the sound of a car coming up the mountain road. My first thought was that someone was bringing me another emergency case, but when the vehicle came into view, I saw it was Sarah's truck. She got out carrying a cardboard box, but she was smiling, always a good sign in our line of work. "Tom, you need to see this," she said, setting the box down carefully on the porch table. "This little guy was brought to the clinic this morning, hit by a car, but the injuries aren't too serious. Thing is, when we were examining him, we found something interesting." She opened the box to reveal a young raccoon, maybe 4 months old, with distinctive markings around his eyes and ears. He looked up at us with bright, alert eyes, showing none of the fearfulness typical of wild raccoons in captivity. Hope immediately moved to investigate, sniffing carefully at the newcomer. When she'd completed her examination, she looked up at me and made a sound I'd learned to recognize, her "this one belongs here" call. "Sarah," I said slowly, studying the young raccoon's markings, "do you think this could be Hope's baby?" She nodded. "Different coloring, but the facial structure is identical. And Tom, here's the really amazing part. When we were treating him, he kept looking around like he was searching for something. Or someone." As if on cue, the young raccoon stretched out his tiny paw toward Hope, making a soft, chittering sound. She responded immediately, gently grooming his head with her tongue while making the same encouraging sounds I'd heard her use with all our recovering patients. "Well, I'll be damned," I breathed, echoing the words I'd spoken that first night when everything changed. "Hope, is this your baby? Did you get your baby back?" I'll never know for certain whether this was the same cub I'd held as he died in my kitchen that morning, or whether this was simply another raccoon that Hope had decided to adopt. In the end, it didn't matter. What mattered was that love had found a way to complete itself, that Hope had been rewarded with new life, that healing had created space for joy to return. We named him Chance, and he became Hope's shadow, learning from her how to help with the other animals, how to comfort the frightened ones and encourage the recovering ones. Together, they made the best rehabilitation team I'd ever worked with. As I write this story, 5 years have passed since that night when Hope first trusted me with her dying baby. The Walker Wildlife Sanctuary has helped over 300 animals return to the wild, and Hope has been part of every single recovery. She's taught me that healing isn't just about medical intervention. It's about creating families where none existed before, building bridges between species that shouldn't trust each other, but somehow do. Home is where the heart heals, Emma used to say, and now I understand what she meant. This mountain, this sanctuary, this partnership with a remarkable raccoon who saw something worth saving in a broken man. This is home. This is where broken things become whole again, where second chances bloom into new beginnings, where love proves stronger than loss. Every morning when I step onto my porch with my coffee, Hope and Chance are waiting for me, ready to begin another day of healing together. And every morning, I remember that sometimes the smallest acts of trust can rebuild the largest broken hearts. Sometimes grace comes to us in the most unexpected forms, carrying the most precious gifts, asking only that we remember who we're meant to be. Friends, there's something I need to share with you today about second chances and the unexpected angels that walk into our lives when we need them most. At 68, I've learned that our deepest wounds often become our greatest sources of healing, not just for ourselves, but for others who desperately need what we have to offer. That raccoon mother didn't just bring me her dying baby that night. She brought me back to myself. Back to the man my late wife Emma always believed I could be. You see, we spend so much time protecting ourselves from more heartbreak that we forget the very thing that broke us might be the key to healing others. Every morning when I see Hope and Chance waiting on my porch, I'm reminded that love doesn't end when we lose someone precious. It transforms into something bigger, more purposeful than we ever imagined possible. The Walker Wildlife Sanctuary isn't just about saving animals, it's about proving that it's never too late to rediscover your purpose, to turn your pain into someone else's hope, to build a legacy of love that honors those we've lost while embracing those who still need us. What unexpected moment in your life led you back to your true purpose? Have you ever experienced an animal showing you unconditional forgiveness when you needed it most? Share your story in the comments below. I'd love to hear how grace found its way to you.